The Simpsons is remembered as the Yellow Family, Bart's catchphrases, a cartoon that ran forever and won every award in the room. That's the legend most people carry around. The people who actually built it remember something messier and stranger. In this video, we look back at the golden age of The Simpsons. From Ullman Shorts to Springfield's first family, Matt Groening sat in the lobby of James L. Brooks's office, holding a comic strip he was about to lose. That comic strip was called Life in Hell, and it was the reason he had been called in for this meeting in the first place. Within a few minutes, he would put that comic strip aside and sketch out a brand new family instead, one that would carry his name farther than Life in Hell ever could. To understand how strange this turn of events really was, it helps to know what Groening had built before that day. He had spent years drawing Life in Hell, a comic strip about a rabbit named Binky and his one-eared son Bongo, both of them stuck in a bleak and funny version of everyday life. Groening had started the strip on his own, self-publishing small collections with his partner at the time, Deborah Kaplan. Slowly, that following grew. By the early 1980s, Life in Hell had a real cult audience, the kind of small but loyal readership that eventually gets noticed by bigger publishers. Pantheon Books picked it up and began distributing his collections nationally, which meant Groening's Rabbit and his troubles were now reaching readers well outside the alternative newspapers where the strip had started. Around that same time, James L. Brooks was already one of the most respected people working in American comedy. Brooks had co-created The Mary Tyler Moore Show and Taxi, two sitcoms that treated their characters with more care and honesty than most comedies of their era. He had also moved into film, and by 1983, he had earned wide praise for the movie Terms of Endearment, a story that mixed real sadness with real humor without ever losing its balance. Brooks had a track record of building shows and films where jokes and genuine emotion could sit right next to each other, and that instinct would matter enormously once his path crossed with Groening's. By the mid-1980s, Brooks was producing a new sketch and variety show for the Fox network called The Tracy Ullman Show. Fox itself was still young and small at the time, trying to build an audience against three older networks that had been broadcasting for decades. The Ullman Show was built around comedian Tracy Ullman, mixing sketch comedy with musical numbers and other bits. Brooks wanted something extra to fill in the small gaps of time right before and after commercial breaks, so he came up with the idea of using short animated segments, each one only about a minute long, as a kind of bridge between the live pieces of the show. Brooks had seen some of Groening's Life in Hell strips and thought Groening might be the right person to create these short animated pieces. He invited him in to pitch an idea. As Groening understood it walking into the building, his plan was simple. He would offer up an animated version of Life in Hell, using the same rabbit and the same jokes he had already spent years building a following around. That felt like the obvious choice. He already had the characters. He already had situations that worked on the page. All he had to do was describe how it might move and talk on screen. Then, while sitting in the waiting area outside Brooks's office, Groening thought through the details of what he was about to offer, and he realized there was a real problem. Turning Life in Hell into a television cartoon would mean signing over some of the rights to characters he had built his entire career on. Life in Hell was not just another job to him. It was his most personal work, something he had built slowly and carefully over many years with almost no one's help but his own. Giving up any piece of ownership over that, even in exchange for a much bigger audience, felt like too big a risk to take on the spot. With only a few minutes left before the meeting, Groening changed course completely. He grabbed a pad of paper and quickly sketched out a new set of characters, a family this time, instead of a rabbit and his son. He based this family loosely on his own. He gave the father the name Homer, which happened to be his own father's real name. He gave the mother the name Marge, short for Margaret, after his own mother. Two of the daughters were named Lisa and Maggie, matching the names of his two younger sisters. For the son, Groening avoided using his own first name directly. Instead, he chose Bart, a name that is also an anagram of the word brat, using the exact same letters rearranged into a different word that hinted at what kind of kid this character would turn out to be. Bart carried a version of Groening's own personality and childhood troublemaking, dressed up in a completely new name and a completely new face. In just a few minutes of sketching, Groening had built the foundation of a family that would eventually be recognized almost everywhere on the planet. He walked into Brooks's office and pitched this new idea idea instead of the one he had planned to bring. Brooks liked what he saw. There was a third person involved early on whose contribution mattered just as much. Sam Simon, who worked alongside Brooks, helped co-write and produce these early shorts, and he would go on to shape much more of the show once it grew into a full series later on. Simon had a strong sense of structure and character work, and that skill would end up guiding the show through some of its most important years. Once the idea was approved, the shorts needed to actually get made, which meant finding an animation studio willing to take on the project quickly and cheaply. The job went to a studio called Klasky Chupo, run by Gabor Chupo and Arlene Klasky. A small team of animators worked on bringing Groening's sketches to life, including David Silverman, Bill Kopp, and Wes Archer. In the later years of the shorts, the work fell mostly to Silverman and Archer. Groening wrote the shorts himself, and the studio handled turning his rough drawings into short moving cartoons that could air in those small gaps around the commercial breaks. Casting the voices came next, and this step ended up shaping the show in ways nobody fully understood yet. Dan Castellaneta and Julie Kavner were already working on the Tracey Ullman Show in live-action sketch roles, and they were brought in to voice Homer and Marge. Nancy Cartwright and Yeardley Smith joined as well, though their roles shifted a bit over time. In the earliest shorts, Yeardley Smith actually provided a voice used for Maggie, and Groening himself supplied the sound of Maggie's pacifier being sucked. Nancy Cartwright would eventually settle into playing Bart, a role she is still known for decades later. None of these actors had any idea at the time that the small characters they were voicing in tiny cartoon bumpers would end up defining a large part of their careers. The very first of these shorts, called Good Night, aired on April 19, 1987, right there on the Tracey Ullman Show. It ran for about a minute and introduced the Simpson family to television audiences for the first time, showing Homer trying to get his kids to sleep with mixed results. This was not a full episode with a real plot the way people think of Simpsons episodes today. It was closer to a quick comic sketch, just enough time to introduce a joke and land it before cutting to a commercial. Over the next 3 seasons of the Tracey Ullman Show, more of these shorts followed, slowly building up the personalities of Homer, Marge, Bart, Lisa, and Maggie piece by piece. The shorts kept running until May 1990, closing out with one called TV Simpsons, which aired after the half-hour Simpsons series had already begun airing separately. During those 3 years on The Ullman Show, audience awareness of these characters stayed fairly limited. A marketing study from that period found that only about 14% of Americans recognized the shorts by name while they were still airing as part of Ullman's program. That number would look almost unbelievable within just a year or two, once the half-hour show took off on its own. While the shorts were still airing, Brooks began pushing to turn the Simpson family into their own full-length show, separate from Ullman's program entirely. This meant negotiating directly with Fox, and Brooks used his standing in the industry to secure something unusual for the time. He built a provision into the contract that prevented Fox from interfering too heavily with the creative content of the new show. Fox executives, still trying to build their network into something that could compete with the bigger three, were willing to give Brooks more creative freedom than most networks would have allowed, mostly because they needed something that could pull in an audience and set their network apart. That freedom mattered enormously once the half-hour version of the show came together. Groening, along with Brooks and Sam Simon, worked out how to stretch these one-minute jokes into a full-length story with actual plots, subplots, and a character development. The tone shifted. The show could now spend real time on Homer's frustrations at work, Marge's quiet exhaustion, Bart's troublemaking at school, and Lisa's growing awareness that she saw the world a little differently than the rest of her family. These were still short comic bits at their core, but now they had room to breathe. The half-hour series debuted on December 17, 1989, with a Christmas special called Simpsons Roasting on an Open Fire. That episode followed the Simpson family through a rough holiday season, with Homer taking on a side job as a mall Santa after his Christmas bonus falls through, and the family later adopting a dog that Bart names Santa's Little Helper. It was warmer and more grounded than a lot of people expected from a cartoon that had started as quick jokes squeezed between commercials. The special was originally supposed to debut earlier in the year, but production delays pushed the premiere back to December, right in time for the holiday season, which turned out to work well for a story built entirely around Christmas. Almost immediately, the show found an audience much larger than anyone connected to the Ullman shorts had seen. It quickly became the first Fox series to land among the top 30 highest-rated shows of its season, a real milestone for a network that had struggled for years to compete with the older, more established networks. That success caught the attention of network executives who were suddenly looking at a show they had underestimated just a year earlier. Looking back at how this all started, it is worth remembering how much of it came down to a handful of small decisions made under pressure. Groening's choice to abandon his original pitch in a hallway, made in a matter of minutes, ended up shaping the direction of animated television for decades. Brooks's decision to give the new show real creative freedom protected the writers and producers from network interference at a stage when many networks would have pushed for something safer and more predictable. Sam Simon's early involvement helped give the shorts a sense of structure that carried over once the show expanded into half-hour episodes. None of these choices looked like history in the making at the time. They looked like ordinary work decisions, made quickly, without much fanfare. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What came next, though, turned this ordinary beginning into something much bigger. Fox's decision to build around this new hit show would end up changing the entire course of the network, and it would set off a chain of events involving ratings battles, scheduling gambles, and even a lawsuit from the very show that had given The Simpsons their start in the first place. Section 2. Fox's Unlikely Savior. Long before Homer Simpson became a household name, Fox Broadcasting Company was the network nobody expected to survive. For decades, American television had been ruled by three networks: ABC, CBS, and NBC, a setup so fixed that most people simply called it the Big Three. Breaking into that group had been tried before and had failed every time. Rupert Murdoch, the owner of News Corporation, believed there was room for a fourth network anyway, and in 1986, he and television executive Barry Diller set out to build one. The building blocks for that network had actually started coming together a year earlier, in March of 1985, when News Corporation spent $250 million to buy half of a company called TCF Holdings, the parent company of the 20th Century Fox movie studio. 2 months after that, in May of 1985, News Corporation agreed to pay $2.5 billion to buy a group of independent television stations located in 6 major American cities, including New York, Washington, Los Angeles, Houston, Chicago, and Dallas. These stations became the seed of the new network. Fox officially launched on October 9, 1986, though its first broadcast was nothing like the sitcoms it would later become known for. The very first thing Fox ever aired was a late-night talk show hosted by comedian Joan Rivers. That show struggled almost immediately. Ratings dropped fast, and by early 1987, Rivers had already left the show. A rotating group of guest hosts kept it going for a short while longer before Fox eventually gave up on the late-night format entirely and shifted its full attention to building a primetime schedule instead. At launch, Fox reached about 80% of American households through roughly 90 independent stations that had agreed to carry its programming, alongside the 6 stations it already owned. That may sound like broad coverage, but compared to the Big Three, it was still a small operation. ABC, CBS, and NBC each had more than 200 affiliate stations, reaching over 97% of homes in the country. Fox was, by any measure, the underdog trying to squeeze into a room that already felt full. Fox's first full night of primetime programming arrived on April 5, 1987, a Sunday. 2 shows anchored that night. One was a sketch and variety program called The Tracy Ullman Show, built around comedian Tracy Ullman performing a rotating cast of characters in short comic scenes. The other was a sitcom about a deeply dysfunctional family called Married with Children, which followed a shoe salesman named Al Bundy and his family through a string of crude and openly unflattering situations. Where the older networks tended to show families that looked wholesome and put together, Married with Children leaned hard into the opposite idea, presenting a family that argued, complained, and rarely resolved anything neatly. The show quickly drew controversy. At one point, a woman in Michigan led a public campaign trying to get the show pulled off the air entirely. That campaign backfired in an unexpected way, since all the news coverage around the controversy ended up giving the show even more attention than it would have gotten on its own. Married with Children went on to run for 11 seasons, becoming one of the earliest proofs that Fox's strategy of embracing edgier, more irreverent programming could actually work as a business plan rather than just a personality quirk. This was the environment The Simpsons was born into. Fox had already built a reputation for programming that felt riskier and less polished than what the older networks offered, and it had already shown a willingness to let controversy work in its favor rather than treating it as something to avoid. By the time the half-hour version of The Simpsons debuted in December of 1989, Fox was no longer airing on just one night a week the way it had at launch. It had expanded gradually, adding new nights of programming over time, while still staying below the number of hours that would have required the government to treat it as a fully regulated network under broadcasting rules at the time. This slower, careful expansion let Fox build up a slate of shows, control costs, and figure out what kind of programming actually worked for its audience before committing to a bigger schedule. The success of The Simpsons arrived faster and bigger than almost anyone at Fox seemed to expect. During its first season, the show became the very first Fox series in the network's short history to land among the top 30 highest-rated programs of the entire television season. For a network that had only been broadcasting in primetime for a couple of years, this was an enormous milestone. It proved that Fox could produce something capable of pulling real, mainstream attention away from the older networks, not just niche interest from younger or more adventurous viewers. The show also picked up early recognition from the television industry itself. During its first season, The Simpsons won 1 Emmy Award and received 4 additional nominations, an unusually strong showing for any new series, let alone an animated one airing on the newest and smallest network in the country. That early success created a strange kind of problem for Fox executives. The Simpsons had built a loyal following airing on Sunday nights at 8 o'clock, and it had climbed into the top 10 shows on television while sitting in that slot. Rather than leaving a proven hit alone, Fox made a decision that many people involved with the show strongly disagreed with at the time. Executives decided to move The Simpsons out of its Sunday night home and into a new slot on Thursday nights, at the same 8 o'clock hour. The goal behind this move was straightforward from a business standpoint. Fox hoped that placing its biggest hit on a new night would help boost the ratings of whatever shows aired directly after it that evening, effectively using The Simpsons as a tool to build up a second strong night of programming instead of just one. The problem with this plan became obvious almost immediately once people looked at what already occupied that Thursday night hour. The Cosby Show, an enormously popular sitcom starring Bill Cosby as a warm, successful father raising his family in a comfortable New York home, was airing in that exact time slot on NBC, and it had been the single most watched show on all of television for years. Putting The Simpsons directly against The Cosby Show meant putting a scrappy, controversial new cartoon up against one of the most dominant and beloved sitcoms in the history of the medium. Many of the people working on The Simpsons pushed back against the move, pointing out that the show had already proven itself as a top 10 performer on Sunday nights, and worried that shifting it into open competition with Cosby would undo all of that progress. Those worries turned out to be justified. Once the move went into effect in the fall of 1990, new episodes of The Cosby Show beat new episodes of The Simpsons in the ratings every single time that season. By the end of that television season, the difference in performance was stark. The Cosby Show finished as the 5th highest-rated show on all of American television, while The Simpsons had fallen all the way down to 38th place, a significant drop from its earlier position inside the top 10. The show stayed in that Thursday night slot for several years, continuing to face Cosby head-on, before Fox eventually moved it back to Sunday nights during its 6th season, where it has remained ever since. The rivalry between the two shows became something the press paid close attention to at the time, partly because the two shows represented such different ideas about what a family on television should look like. The Cosby Show presented a warm, stable, high-achieving family that rarely let real conflict boil over into anything lasting. The Simpsons, by contrast, built its entire comic engine out of exactly the kind of family dysfunction that Cosby avoided, with a father who made bad decisions constantly, children who mouthed off to authority figures, and problems that often got worse before getting better, if they got better at all. Bill Cosby himself spoke publicly about the comparison during this period, expressing the view that television should be moving forward from the kind of family shown on his program rather than backward towards something rougher and less admirable, and suggesting that people who found value in that rougher kind of storytelling were mistaking cruelty for edge. Around the same time, Barbara Bush, serving as First Lady of the United States, told a magazine that she considered the show one of the least intelligent things she had ever come across on television. Criticism like this became a fairly common feature of coverage about the show during its early years, with plenty of parents, teachers, and public figures expressing concern that Bart Simpson in particular modeled disrespectful behavior for children who might imitate him. Despite the criticism, and despite losing the ratings battle against Cosby for a long stretch, The Simpsons eventually managed a symbolic win over its rival. In February of 1992, an episode called Homer at the Bat, which found Homer managing the power plant softball team and dealing with a roster secretly stacked with real professional baseball players in disguise, beat The Cosby Show in the ratings for the first time. It was a turning point that showed The Simpsons had built a strong and stable enough audience to occasionally outperform even the most dominant sitcom on television, even while still airing in that difficult Thursday slot. The Cosby Show itself wrapped up its run in 1992, ending the head-to-head competition for good, though The Simpsons remained on Thursday nights for a while longer before finally moving back to Sunday. One lasting trace of this rivalry ended up built directly into the world of Springfield. Dr. Julius Hibbert, a recurring character introduced early in the show's run as the Simpson family's physician, developed a persona that closely echoed Bill Cosby's public image, right down to sharing a similar warm laugh and a habit of wearing colorful sweaters. Over time, this parody became one of the more consistent quiet jokes running through the show, offering a way for the writers to needle their old ratings rival without ever needing to mention Cosby by name. While Fox was busy managing its scheduling war against Cosby, an entirely different kind of conflict was building behind the scenes, one that had nothing to do with ratings and everything to do with who actually deserved credit and profit for creating the Simpson family in the first place. Tracy Ullman, whose variety show had given The Simpsons their earliest home as short animated bits between sketches, filed a lawsuit against 20th Century Fox in 1991. Her complaint argued that her original contract for the Tracy Ullman Show entitled her to a percentage, somewhere between 5 and 10%, of the net profits earned from any spin-off characters that appeared on her program, even characters that had been created by someone else. Since the Simpson family had first appeared as part of her show before growing into their own separate series, Ullman argued that this contract clause meant she was owed a meaningful share of the money The Simpsons had gone on to earn, particularly from merchandise sales. That merchandise money was not a small consideration. By 1990, licensing and merchandising tied to The Simpsons had already generated an estimated $750 million, according to figures reported at the time by a trade publication that tracked licensing revenue across the entertainment industry. That put the Simpson family just behind the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and New Kids on the Block as the third most popular licensed characters of that year, an extraordinary number for characters that had only been airing in their own half-hour show for less than a year. Ullman's legal complaint specifically pointed to 7.5% of adjusted gross profits from merchandising as the figure she believed she was owed, based on the terms of her original agreement with Brooks's production company, Gracie Films. Notably, Ullman chose not to name Gracie Films directly as a defendant in her lawsuit, a decision that industry observers at the time believed was meant to avoid damaging her professional relationship with James L. Brooks, who had produced both her show and The Simpsons. She was represented in the case by an entertainment attorney named Michael Bergman. She was not the only person connected to the old Ullman Show pursuing a claim either. Kenneth Eston, one of the executive producers of The Tracy Ullman Show, filed a separate lawsuit around the same time, arguing that his own contract entitled him to 7.5% of revenues from the show, which he argued should include a portion of the merchandising money generated by The Simpsons as well. The case went to trial in Los Angeles Superior Court, and testimony centered heavily on the question of who had actually created the Simpson characters and how much creative involvement, if any, Ullman had in shaping them. James L. Brooks testified that the characters had been created by Matt Groening and that Ullman herself had played no role in developing them beyond hosting the show they first appeared on. The jury did not take long to reach a decision. After deliberating for less than 5 hours, jurors sided completely with Fox, rejecting Ullman's claim on October 22, 1992. Had she won, the ruling would have brought her more than $2,250,000 in profits tied to the show's success. Instead, she walked away with nothing beyond what she had already been paid for her original work on the Ullman program, reportedly around $58,000 in royalties tied to The Simpsons specifically, along with the $3 million she had already earned for her own show across its 3.5 seasons on the air. Ullman's relationship with the characters that had launched partly out of her own program stayed somewhat prickly for years afterward. She did make one appearance on The Simpsons itself, guest starring in a second season episode as a stern obedience school instructor, but she never returned to the show again after that. In later interviews and stage performances, she occasionally joked about how much money had been made off products connected to the Simpson family, listing off everything from cereal to bath products with a kind of exaggerated resignation, all while insisting she held no lasting bitterness about how things had turned out. Whatever her private feelings were, the legal outcome was clear and final. The characters, and the enormous business built around them, belonged entirely to Groening, Brooks, and the studio behind the show, with no ongoing obligation to share any of it with the show that had given the Simpson family their very first minute of screen time. By the early 1990s, Fox had two clear proofs that its strategy of embracing riskier, more unconventional programming could pay off in a very real way. Married with Children had shown that a family sitcom built on conflict and crude humor instead of warmth could hold an audience for years. The Simpsons had shown something even bigger, proving that an animated show built around a deeply flawed family could not only survive direct competition with the most dominant sitcom in the country, but eventually beat it, win industry awards almost immediately, and generate enough merchandising revenue to spark a genuine legal battle over who deserved a cut of the profits. None of that success had come without turbulence. The Thursday night move against Cosby had cost the show real ratings ground for years before it recovered. The lawsuit from Ullman had raised uncomfortable questions about ownership and credit that took a jury trial to settle. Public figures ranging from a former First Lady to Cosby himself had used their platforms to criticize the show's influence on children. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. None of that turbulence slowed down what was happening outside the courtroom and away from the ratings charts, though. While lawyers argued over percentages of merchandising profits in a Los Angeles courtroom, an entire wave of actual merchandise featuring Bart Simpson was already flooding stores, classrooms, and shopping malls across the country, setting off a cultural moment that would soon collide directly with schools, parents, and a growing sense among some adults that this cartoon family had gotten a little too big for its own good. Section 3. Bartmania. By the middle of 1990, a phrase started showing up in newspapers and news broadcasts across the country that had not existed a year earlier. That phrase was Bartmania, and it described something that had genuinely caught nearly everyone off guard, including the people who worked on the show itself. A yellow cartoon boy with spiky hair had somehow become one of the most recognizable faces in the entire country, showing up on shirts, toys, posters, and school playgrounds faster than anyone at Fox or at the studios producing the merchandise seemed prepared for. The center of all this attention was Bart Simpson, the 10-year-old troublemaker at the heart of the Simpson family. Bart's personality had been designed from the very beginning to carry a rebellious streak, and that streak turned out to resonate with kids and teenagers in a way that went far beyond what a typical cartoon character usually achieved. He talked back to authority figures, got into trouble at school, and delivered smart remarks with a confidence that felt exciting to young viewers who spent most of their day being told what to do by parents and teachers. Adults who worried about the influence of television on children saw exactly the same qualities and reached the opposite conclusion, viewing Bart as a bad example dressed up in bright colors and catchy one-liners. Nowhere did this tension show up more clearly than in the fight over a single t-shirt. Sometime around 1989 and 1990, a company called Changes Incorporated began producing a white t-shirt featuring an image of Bart aiming a slingshot, with the word underachiever printed above him and a small speech bubble showing him saying he was proud of it. The shirt became one of the best-selling pieces of Simpsons merchandise almost immediately, riding the wave of a show that was, at that exact moment, one of the most watched programs on all of American television. It did not take long before school administrators began treating the shirt as a genuine problem rather than harmless fashion. The first major flashpoint happened at Lutz Elementary School in Fremont, Ohio, where a principal named William Crumnow banned the shirt outright. Crumnow explained his reasoning to a reporter from the Deseret news that spring, arguing that being proud of failing to try was the exact opposite of what a school was supposed to stand for. He felt the shirt sent the wrong message to children about effort and achievement, and he was not willing to let students walk around wearing that message on their chests. Word of the ban spread quickly, and rather than making the shirt less popular, the attention seemed to make kids want it even more. Krumnow was far from alone. School districts in Florida, California, Michigan, Illinois, and Washington, D.C. all took similar action around the same time, cracking down on the sudden surge of Bart shirts appearing in hallways and classrooms. The underachiever shirt was not the only target either. Other shirts featuring Bart delivering lines like "Get bent" or "Eat my shorts" ran into the same kind of trouble, along with a shirt that had Bart introducing himself by name and then bluntly asking who the person reading it happened to be, a line one school official flagged specifically for its rude tone. Students caught wearing these shirts faced a range of punishments depending on the school. At Brookwood Junior High in Glenwood, Illinois, teachers made students call home so a parent could bring a change of clothes. Other schools required students to turn the shirts inside out for the rest of the day, hiding the offending image and text against their own skin. Some teachers simply grabbed a strip of tape and covered up the words directly on the shirt, leaving the rest of the design visible. The controversy grew large enough that by the summer of 1990, the retail chain J.C. Penney made the decision to pull the underachiever shirts entirely from its children's clothing sections, a striking move for a major national retailer to make over a cartoon character's merchandise. Groening, for his part, treated the entire backlash with a shrug. When reporters asked him directly about the wave of bans sweeping through schools, he responded that he had no comment, adding somewhat dryly that he had been raised to respect elementary school principals, even the ones who apparently had nothing better to do than police what children wore to class. It was a mild jab, but it captured how little concern the people actually making the show had for the idea that Bart's attitude needed correcting. Despite, or perhaps partly because of, all this controversy, the shirts kept selling at an extraordinary pace. Estimates from the time put total sales of Bart Simpson t-shirts at around 15 million units in 1990 alone, an enormous number for a single piece of merchandise tied to one television character. Part of what made the shirt frenzy even stranger was a detail that fans still bring up decades later. Early official Bart merchandise, including some of these shirts, sometimes depicted Bart wearing a light blue shirt instead of his usual orange one, a mismatch that has never been fully explained and has led to years of speculation among collectors about rushed production schedules and licensing mix-ups. To this day, nobody involved with the show has offered a clear, confirmed explanation for why that blue shirt version exists at all, and it remains one of the small unsolved mysteries of the character's early merchandising. Legitimate manufacturers were not the only ones cashing in either. Unauthorized versions of Bart shirts, made without any licensing agreement at all, began flooding sidewalk vendors and small shops in cities across the country. A 1990 article in the Washington Post specifically looked at the flood of bootleg Bart shirts appearing throughout New York City, noting a detail that added an unexpected layer to the whole phenomenon. Bart's popularity had grown especially strong among black youth in America at the time, a connection that the show's producers leaned into directly when they released two rap-inspired songs built around the character, one called "Do the Bartman" and another called "Deep Deep Trouble." Both songs treated Bart's rebellious reputation as something worth celebrating rather than correcting, which lined up with how a large part of his young audience already saw him. Merchandise went well beyond t-shirts, of course. A toy company called Dandy produced an entire line of Simpsons toys during this period, and while the company made a wide range of items, the biggest sellers by far were Bart Simpson dolls, including pull-string versions that played back short recorded phrases when a child yanked the string on the doll's back. These talking dolls became some of the most sought-after toys of the entire Bartmania period, sitting on store shelves next to lunchboxes, posters, buttons, and eventually an entire wall of products built around a character who less than 2 years earlier had existed only as a quick sketch on a notepad in a waiting room. The backlash against Bart eventually reached all the way to the highest levels of American government. In 1990, Barbara Bush, serving as First Lady at the time, gave an interview to People magazine in which she described The Simpsons as the dumbest thing she had ever seen on television. The comment might have faded quickly into the background noise of celebrity opinions, if not for what happened next. A letter arrived at the White House written from the perspective of Marge Simpson, expressing genuine hurt over the comment and pointing out that the Simpson family, whatever its flaws, tried to teach its children not to speak badly of others, even people who happened to be far wealthier and more powerful than themselves. The letter noted, gently but directly, how difficult difficult that lesson became to teach when the country's own First Lady had just called the family not merely dumb, but the dumbest thing she had ever encountered. Barbara Bush responded with a letter of her own, and her reply turned out to be surprisingly warm given how the whole exchange had started. She thanked Marge for writing and admitted, with a touch of humor, that she had not realized the character had a mind of her own until that letter arrived. She went on to suggest that the Simpson family actually set a fairly good example for the rest of the country, a notable turnaround from her original comment just months earlier. The exchange became one of the more oddly good-natured footnotes of the entire Bartmania period, a moment where a fictional cartoon mother and a real First Lady found some common ground through a handwritten letter. That peace did not last very long once Barbara's husband entered the picture directly. On January 27, 1992, President George H.W. Bush addressed the National Religious Broadcasters Convention and used the moment to make a broader point about American values. In his remarks, preserved in the official public papers of the presidency, Bush said the country needed to move closer to the kind of family shown on the older television program The Waltons and further away from the kind of family shown on The Simpsons, framing the comparison as part of a larger point about decency and rejecting incivility. The line drew laughter from the crowd in the room, but it also guaranteed that the feud between the Bush family and the Simpson family was far from over. The response from the show's producers came remarkably fast. Just 3 days later, on January 30th, 1992, the newest episode of The Simpsons opened with a brief scene showing the family gathered around their television watching a clip of Bush's speech. After hearing the president's comparison, Bart turned toward the screen and pointed out that the Simpsons were plenty like the Waltons too, since both families spent plenty of time praying for an end to hard economic times, a pointed reference to the early 1990s recession that was affecting households across the country at that exact moment. Turning around a direct response to a presidential speech within just a few days was an unusually fast piece of production for an animated show, since animation typically requires long lead times between when a script is finalized and when the finished footage is ready to air, making this quick rebuttal a small production achievement on top of being a memorable joke. Bush lost the general election to Bill Clinton later that same year, in November of 1992, ending his time in the White House less than a year after his comments about the Simpson family. Whether or not the feud with a cartoon family played any meaningful role in that outcome is impossible to say with any real confidence, but the timing left plenty of fans of the show happy to point out the coincidence anyway. The rivalry between the two families did not disappear completely even after Bush left office. Years later, the show revisited the joke directly in an episode where George and Barbara Bush were depicted moving into a house across the street from The Simpsons in Springfield, giving the writers one more chance to play with the contrast between the two families that had briefly become part of a real, if lighthearted, national conversation about what an American family was supposed to look like. Looking back at this entire stretch of the show's early history, what stands out is how much of it played out completely outside the actual episodes airing on Thursday and then later Sunday nights. School principals in Ohio, executives at JCPenney, a sitting First Lady, and eventually a sitting president all found themselves reacting publicly to a cartoon that had barely existed as a half-hour show for more than a year or two. None of these people were responding to complicated plots or specific storylines. They were responding to an image, a slogan on a shirt, and a general sense that this particular cartoon family represented something looser and more disrespectful than what they were used to seeing on television. That reaction, whether it came in the form of a school ban, a magazine interview, or a presidential speech, ended up feeding directly into the show's growing cultural footprint rather than slowing it down. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. While all of this played out in schools, retail stores, and even the White House, a completely different kind of collision was happening at the same time, one that brought the actual king of pop into direct contact with Bart Simpson, producing a hit song that spent years shrouded in half-true rumors before anyone involved was willing to say clearly what had really happened behind the scenes. Section 4. The Blues Album and the Secret King of Pop. In the fall of 1990, deep into production on the second season of the show, the people behind The Simpsons decided to try something unusual. Rather than simply letting the show run on its own, they put together a full-length music album built entirely around the Simpson family, mixing original comic songs with old blues standards performed in character. The album was called The Simpsons Sing the Blues, and it arrived in stores on December 4th, 1990, right in the middle of the holiday shopping season. Nobody involved seemed fully prepared for how well it would do. The album shot up to number 3 on the Billboard 200 chart, an almost unheard-of result for what was, on paper, a novelty record built around a cartoon. The album mixed two very different kinds of material. Part of it leaned on classic blues songs originally performed by artists like Billie Holiday, giving the Simpson family voice cast a chance to put their own spin on older musical standards. The rest of the album was made up of brand new songs written specifically for the project, built around comic lyrics that matched the personalities of the characters singing them. This combination gave the record a strange but appealing identity, part tribute to old American music and part pure cartoon comedy, and it helped the album stand out from ordinary television tie-in records that usually got treated as disposable novelty items rather than something people might actually want to own and listen to repeatedly. The lead single from that album ended up becoming one of the strangest and most successful pieces of music tied to the show's entire history. That single was called "Do the Bartman," a pop rap song built around Bart's rebellious personality, performed using Nancy Cartwright's voice as Bart. The song was written by a songwriter and producer named Brian Loren, and it was released as a single on November 20th, 1990, a couple of weeks ahead of the full album. Even before the single officially came out, rumors had already started spreading that summer, suggesting that pop superstar Michael Jackson might be involved in writing a song for Bart. Fox executives working on the negotiations reportedly wanted to keep any Jackson involvement secret during that period, but word still managed to leak out and only added more excitement and attention to the upcoming album. It turned out those rumors were true, though the full truth would not be confirmed publicly for years. Michael Jackson did in fact provide backing vocals on "Do the Bartman," working closely with Brian Loren on the song. According to Groening, Jackson was the person who came up with the idea to call the song "Do the Bartman" in the first place, and Jackson specifically insisted that his own name be worked into the lyrics somehow, which is why one line of the finished song compares doing the Bartman dance to being as impressive as Michael Jackson himself. None of this was obvious to casual fans at the time, since Jackson's name never appeared anywhere in the official credits for the song. That absence was not an oversight. Jackson was under contract with another record label at the time the song was made, and that contract legally prevented him from receiving credit for work released through a different label's project. Groening later explained that Jackson was, without question, genuinely involved in creating the song, even if the full story of exactly how much he contributed as a writer stayed murkier for years afterward. The response to "Do the Bartman" overseas was remarkable. The song was never officially released as a single in the United States at all, yet it managed to become a massive hit almost everywhere else in the world. It reached number 1 on the singles charts in Australia, Ireland, Luxembourg, New Zealand, Norway, and the United Kingdom, and climbed into the top 10 in several other countries including Belgium, Denmark, Finland, the Netherlands, Spain, and Sweden. In the United Kingdom specifically, the song spent 3 full weeks sitting at the very top of the official singles chart, a run of success that made it the 7th best-selling song in the entire country for the year 1991. The single eventually shipped more than 400,000 units in the United Kingdom alone and was certified gold there by the British phonographic industry on February 1st, 1991. That UK chart-topping run made the Simpson family the first cartoon characters to reach number 1 on that chart, since a group called the Archies had done it back in 1969 with a song called "Sugar Sugar" more than 2 decades earlier. A follow-up single from the same album called "Deep Deep Trouble" also charted well, peaking at number 7 in the United Kingdom that April and spending 9 weeks at the top of the Irish singles chart around the same period. A music video for "Do the Bartman" was released in 1991, directed by Brad Bird, an animator who was closely connected to the Simpsons production team at the time, and who would later go on to direct several major animated films for other studios. The video became a genuine hit on MTV in the United States, and it earned a nomination at the 1991 MTV Video Music Awards, an unusual honor for a song that had not even received an official commercial release inside the country airing the awards show. The full truth about Jackson's involvement stayed a carefully guarded secret for years. It was not until 1998, during an appearance at the World Animation Celebration Convention in Pasadena, California, that Groening finally confirmed publicly what many fans had long suspected. Speaking to a crowd gathered specifically for a tribute to The Simpsons, Groening revealed that "Do the Bartman" had actually been co-written and co-produced by Jackson, though contractual restrictions with his own record label had prevented him from ever receiving public credit for that work. Groening added that he found it genuinely surprising that nobody had figured out the truth sooner, especially given how big a fan of the show Jackson had always been. That fandom was not just a passing interest either. According to accounts from people close to the production, Jackson had personally called up the show's producers late one night, offering to write a chart-topping single for Bart and expressing interest in doing a guest voice spot on the actual television show as well. That phone call eventually led directly to one of the most memorable guest appearances in the show's entire history. Jackson appeared in an episode called Stark Raving Dad, the premiere episode of the show's third season, which first aired on September 19, 1991. The episode was written by Al Jean and Mike Reese and directed by Rich Moore. The plot of Stark Raving Dad followed Homer through a strange chain of events after a laundry mishap turns one of his white shirts pink, thanks to Bart accidentally washing it together with his father's lucky red cap. Wearing the pink shirt to work the next day gets Homer mistakenly flagged as mentally unstable by his employer, and after Bart fills out part of his father's psychiatric evaluation paperwork carelessly, Homer ends up committed to a mental institution called the New Bedlam Rest Home. Inside the institution, Homer meets a large, calm patient who insists that he is the real Michael Jackson. Homer, who has no real idea who Michael Jackson actually is, simply takes the man's claim at face value without questioning it, which becomes one of the running jokes of the episode. That patient was voiced, in a layered piece of casting that became the episode's central joke, by Michael Jackson himself, playing a character named Leon Kompowski. Jackson provided all of the characters' speaking dialogue directly, but due to the same contractual restrictions that had kept his name off Do the Bartman, he was not permitted to perform any of the characters' singing on screen. Instead, a professional Jackson sound-alike singer named Kip Lennon handled every sung portion of the character's dialogue, while Jackson himself handled the spoken lines. In the show's official credits, his contribution was listed under the pseudonym John J. Smith, keeping his real involvement hidden from casual viewers, even as many critics and fans strongly suspected the truth almost immediately after the episode aired. Behind the scenes, getting Jackson to commit to the role took some extra convincing. Showrunner Al Jean later recalled that Jackson would not fully agree to record the part until after sitting through an in-person read-through of the script, which was held at the house of his manager, Sandy Gallen, rather than at the normal recording studio. During that read-through, Dan Castellaneta, the voice of Homer, arrived about 30 minutes late, and Gene remembered the uncomfortable silence that followed as everyone else simply sat and waited without saying a word until Castellaneta showed up. Once the reading finished, Jackson laid out his conditions clearly, agreeing to voice the role only if he received no on-screen credit, and only if his singing voice was replaced entirely by a sound-alike performer. Inside the story itself, Leon Kompowski's connection to Michael Jackson became more than just a running joke about mistaken identity. A secondary plot follows Lisa, who feels forgotten by Bart as her 8th birthday approaches, since Bart has a habit of forgetting her birthday almost every year. After overhearing Lisa quietly composing an upset letter about her brother, the man believing himself to be Michael Jackson steps in to help mend the relationship between the two siblings. Working together, Bart and Kompowski write and perform an original birthday song for Lisa called Happy Birthday Lisa, which becomes the emotional high point of the episode. Lisa is thrilled by the gift and calls it the best birthday present she has ever received. Only after the song is finished does the man reveal his real identity, explaining that his actual name is Leon Kompowski, a bricklayer from Paterson, New Jersey, who found that speaking and acting like Michael Jackson helped him deal with deep feelings of anger that had built up over much of his life, since adopting that persona made the people around him happier and calmer. That birthday song was not written by the show's regular team of writers. Michael Jackson wrote Happy Birthday Lisa himself specifically for this episode, adding another layer to a guest appearance that already blurred the line between fiction and reality in unusual ways. The episode also worked in more direct references to Jackson's real musical career, with the Kompowski character singing brief snippets of actual Jackson songs, including Billie Jean and Ben, layering the joke about mistaken identity with genuine nods to the real music Jackson was famous for at the time. There had even been early plans for a follow-up appearance built around this same storyline. According to later reporting, Kompowski was originally intended to return in a second episode, episode, this time reimagined as an impersonator convinced he was the musician Prince rather than Michael Jackson. Prince was reportedly asked to voice that follow-up version of the character, but he turned down the script, and the planned sequel episode was never produced. For many years after it first aired, Stark Raving Dad stood as one of the most fondly remembered guest appearances in the show's history, praised specifically for its writing and for how naturally Jackson's real-life persona folded into the emotional core of the story about a forgotten birthday and a strained sibling relationship. That reputation shifted significantly later on, following the broader public reckoning with serious allegations against Jackson that resurfaced with new intensity after a documentary called Leaving Neverland premiered on March 7, 2019, presenting further accusations of abuse tied to Jackson's history. Shortly after that documentary's premiere, executive producer James L. Brooks announced that Stark Raving Dad would be pulled from future syndication packages, streaming platforms, and any future physical releases of the show going forward. Brooks addressed the decision directly, comparing it to editing a single chapter out of a larger book, rather than attempting to erase Jackson from history altogether, and stressing that the choice was not meant as anything resembling book burning. Despite this removal from ongoing circulation, copies of the episode already sold on earlier physical releases of the show's third season remained unaffected, and the episode quietly returned to syndicated broadcast on the FXX channel by October of that same year, showing that even this particular decision was not treated as entirely permanent or absolute. Looking back at this entire chapter of the show's history, what stands out most is how thoroughly the show's early success spilled over into the actual music industry rather than staying confined to television screens. A Cartoon Family topped real international singles charts, earned an actual gold certification from a national music trade group, and pulled one of the most famous musicians on the planet into direct, hands-on collaboration, first through an anonymous songwriting credit and later through an on-screen guest appearance built entirely around his own real-world fame. Almost none of this success came through the ordinary channels a normal album or a normal guest voice arrangement would have used. It came through secrecy, careful contract navigation, and a level of genuine personal enthusiasm from Jackson that nobody working on the show could have simply requested or paid for. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. None of this crossover into music charts and celebrity collaborations happened by accident. It came directly out of the writer's room responsible for building every joke, every plot, and every character on the show in the first place. A room stocked with an unusually specific kind of comedic talent that had been quietly assembling itself since the very first season, long before anyone realized just how influential that small group of writers would eventually become. Section 5. The Harvard Lampoon Pipeline. By the time The Simpsons was ready to start hiring writers for its very first season, the show needed people who could do something unusual. It needed writers who could make jokes, land inside real emotional stories, instead of jokes that just sat on top of a plot without connecting to it. The person tasked with finding those writers was Sam Simon, who had co-produced the original Ullman shorts alongside Brooks and Groening, and who took on a leading role in shaping the half-hour series once it launched. Simon turned out to have a very specific instinct for spotting comic talent, and the choices he made in those early hiring decisions ended up defining the show's comedic voice for years afterward. Two of Simon's earliest and most important hires were Al Jean and Mike Reiss, a writing duo who had actually met each other years earlier as freshmen at Harvard University. Both of them wrote for the Harvard Lampoon, the university's student humor magazine, a publication with a long history of producing comedy writers who went on to work professionally in television. Before joining The Simpsons, Jean and Reiss had already built real careers writing for a range of shows, including Johnny Carson's Tonight Show, the sitcom ALLF, and a show called It's Gary Shandling's Show. That combination of experience and comic sensibility caught Sam Simon's attention, and he brought the pair on as the very first staff writers hired for the new series. Because they had been part of the show from its earliest days, Jean and Reiss developed a deep understanding of the characters and the strange little world of Springfield, which let them steer the show creatively once they eventually took over as showrunners during the third season. Jean and Reiss were far from the only Harvard Lampoon writers who ended up working on the show. Two more names, John Swartzwelder and George Meyer, joined the writing staff in the show's earliest years and went on to become two of the most influential writers in the show's entire history, even though neither one of them arrived through quite the same straightforward path as Jean and Reiss. George Meyer's path to the show ran through his own small, strange publishing project. Meyer had attended Harvard as well, where he studied biochemistry and eventually graduated in 1978. Despite earning a degree in that field and even being accepted into medical school, Meyer chose not to enroll, deciding instead to keep pursuing comedy writing. While at Harvard, he served as president of the Harvard Lampoon, an experience he later described as genuinely life-changing, since it was the first place he encountered people who treated the craft of writing jokes with the same seriousness other students applied to their actual academic coursework. His time at Harvard was not without real struggle either. Alongside his Lampoon work, Meyer went through several difficult stretches of depression during his college years, even while his grades stayed fairly average and his comedic output kept growing. After college, Meyer eventually created a small, self-published humor magazine called Army Man, a short-lived project with a limited print run that nonetheless managed to reach exactly the right readers within the world of professional comedy writing. One of those readers was Sam Simon, who liked what he saw in Army Man enough that he went looking for the people behind it. That connection is what eventually brought both George Meyer and John Swartzwelder onto the original writing staff of The Simpsons, beginning in 1989. John Swartzwelder's own background looked nothing like the typical Harvard Lampoon pipeline that produced so many of his future colleagues. He was born on February 8, 1949, in Seattle, Washington, and grew up attending high school in the nearby town of Renton. Rather than moving through an Ivy League humor magazine, Swartzwelder started his career working in advertising, a very different kind of writing, built around short, punchy persuasion rather than character-driven comedy. He later moved into television, working as a writer on Saturday Night Live during the mid-1980s. A stretch of the show that is often remembered as one of its weaker periods. His contributions to George Meyer's Army Man magazine eventually connected him with Sam Simon as well, which is how he ended up joining The Simpsons writing staff at the very start of the series, working on the show continuously from 1989 all the way through 2003, with a final additional contribution years later to The Simpsons movie. Across that long stretch of time, Swartzwelder ended up writing more individual episodes of the show than any other writer in its entire history, credited with 59 full episodes, along with smaller contributions to several others. That total sits far ahead of every other writer who has ever worked on the show, a gap large enough that it has become one of the most repeated facts fans bring up whenever the show's writing staff comes up in conversation. His particular comic style leaned towards strange, often old-fashioned characters that felt like they had wandered in from another era entirely. Things like wandering hobos who played banjos, unsettling cigarette-smoking ventriloquist dummies, baseball players pulled from the 1800s, and eccentric old-timers delivering songs while missing their pants. That specific flavor of humor became so recognizable among the writing staff that colleagues eventually started describing any joke written in that particular style as Swartzweldian, turning his own name into a kind of shorthand adjective for a certain type of surreal comic energy. Swartzwelder became known for more than just his writing style, though. He developed a reputation as one of the most private and reclusive figures to ever come out of American comedy writing, someone who almost never gave interviews and who avoided public appearances almost entirely for decades. Very few photographs of him exist publicly, and for years, the only widely circulated recording of his voice came from an awkward and unplanned phone call rather than any kind of formal interview. That extreme level of privacy became so well known within Simpsons fan communities that some fans half-jokingly speculated Swartzwelder might not even be a real single person, wondering instead if the name was some kind of shared pseudonym used to credit scripts that could not otherwise be properly attributed. He was, in fact, entirely real, though it took until May of 2021 for him to finally break that decades-long silence and grant his very first major interview, conducted over email with humorist Mike Sachs for the New Yorker magazine. That interview offered a rare, direct glimpse into how Swartzwelder actually worked. He described a writing process built around speed, rather than careful, cautious drafting, explaining that he tried to write an entire script all the way through as fast as possible, often within a single day if he could manage it, filling in weaker filler jokes and simple pattern dialogue along the way just to keep the momentum going rather than getting stuck perfecting every single line during that first pass. That approach clearly worked for him in a very practical sense as well. According to reporting on his working habits, Swartzwelder's finished scripts typically needed noticeably less rewriting once they reached the wider writing staff compared to scripts from other contributors, with roughly half of of his original material, surviving into the finished episodes largely untouched. Part of what made his working style so distinctive involved where and how he actually sat down to write. For years, Swartzwelder preferred writing away from the main writer's room entirely, favoring a particular booth inside his favorite diner as his regular workspace. Once California's statewide indoor smoking ban took effect in 1995, that habit ran into a direct problem, since the ban made it illegal for him to smoke while working inside the diner the way he always had. Rather than simply switching to a new location, Swartzwelder had diner-style booths installed inside his own home so he could keep working in a setup that matched the environment he had grown used to. A persistent rumor claimed he had gone so far as to buy the actual physical booth from his favorite diner and move it into his house, though later reporting clarified that the booths he installed were newly built rather than the original furniture itself, even if the underlying story about recreating that exact diner atmosphere at home held up as accurate. By 1994, during production on the show's 6th season, Swartzwelder was granted a special arrangement that let him step away from attending the regular in-person rewrite sessions that the rest of the writing staff took part in together. Instead, he was allowed to send his script drafts in remotely from home, letting other writers handle any group revisions without requiring him to sit through the same collaborative meetings everyone else did. This arrangement is often connected to the tension between his heavy smoking habits and a newly introduced policy banning smoking inside the actual writer's room itself, though Swartzwelder himself later suggested in his New Yorker interview that his shift away from group meetings had more to do with simple fatigue and a long-standing personal preference for working alone rather than being purely about the smoking restrictions. Whatever the exact mix of reasons behind it, the arrangement let him keep producing scripts at his usual pace while avoiding the parts of the job that seemed to interest him the least. Alongside Swartzwelder and Meyer, plenty of other writers moved through the show's early staff and went on to significant careers of their own, further cementing just how concentrated a pool of comic talent had gathered in that one particular writer's room during the late 1980s and early 1990s. David X. Cohen, who wrote for the show early on, later went on to co-create Futurama alongside Groening. Greg Daniels, another early contributor, eventually helped create both King of the Hill and the American version of The Office. Jeff Martin and John Vitti, both connected to the same Harvard Lampoon pipeline that had brought in Gene and Reese, contributed to the show's early comic identity as well. No single writer connected to that early pipeline became more publicly recognizable than Conan O'Brien. Like Gene, Reese, and Meyer before him, O'Brien had attended Harvard, where he majored in history and literature and wrote his senior thesis on the work of William Faulkner and Flannery O'Connor. He also wrote for the Harvard Lampoon during his time there, continuing the same track record that had already produced so many of his future Simpsons colleagues. After college, O'Brien moved to Los Angeles to pursue a comedy writing career, eventually landing a job at Saturday Night Live in 1988. He stayed there for a few years before leaving, citing burnout from the demanding schedule, and shortly after that departure, he was offered a position writing for The Simpsons. O'Brien worked on the show as a writer and producer from 1991 to 1993, a relatively short stretch of time compared to writers like Swartzwelder or Meyer, but one that produced at least one script widely considered among the very best episodes the show ever made. O'Brien wrote Marge vs. the Monorail, the 12th episode of the show's 4th season, which first aired on January 14, 1993. The episode followed Springfield's decision to spend an unexpected $3 million settlement paid by Mr. Burns after getting caught dumping nuclear waste in the town park on a monorail system sold to the town by a fast-talking traveling salesman named Lyle Lanley, voiced by recurring guest star Phil Hartman. The episode also featured a memorable guest appearance from actor Leonard Nimoy playing himself. O'Brien wrote the episode's featured song as well, working alongside Al Jean on what became known simply as the Monorail song. Marge vs. the Monorail has been widely praised by both fans and critics in the years since it first aired, and O'Brien has said in later interviews that among all the episodes he personally wrote for the show, this one remained his favorite. O'Brien's time in The Simpsons writer's room came to an end after roughly 3 years, and the way it ended became something of a small, fond legend among people who worked alongside him. According to O'Brien's own later retelling, it was Swartzwelder himself who eventually told him, in a roundabout and quiet way, that he had become too talented to stay working inside that particular writer's room much longer, and that he needed to go build something of his own instead. O'Brien has said he did not initially take the comment as a simple compliment so much as a gentle nudge to finally move on from what he sometimes described as as feeling like the room's resident court jester. Whatever the intended tone behind it, the advice turned out to be accurate. O'Brien left The Simpsons and went on to host Late Night with Conan O'Brien starting in 1993, launching a long and prominent career as a late-night television host that would eventually include The Tonight Show and several other programs over the following decades. Taken together, this small group of writers, most of them connected in some way to Harvard and its student humor magazine, and a couple of them, like Swartzwelder, arriving through an entirely different route built around advertising work and a tiny self-published magazine, ended up shaping the specific comic voice that defined the show's most celebrated years. Some of them, like Gene and Reese, stayed with the show for decades, eventually running it themselves. Others, like O'Brien, Cohen, and Daniels, passed through for a shorter stretch before moving on to build entirely new shows of their own, carrying pieces of what they had learned in that Springfield writer's room out into completely different corners of television. And one, Swartzwelder, simply kept his head down, wrote more episodes than anyone else in the show's history, and quietly avoided almost all public attention for the better part of 30 years, only breaking that silence once the show's most celebrated era had long since become something people looked back on, rather than something still unfolding week to week. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Exactly which stretch of episodes counts as that most celebrated era, though, turns out to be a surprisingly contested question. Fans, critics, and even people who worked on the show itself have spent years arguing over precisely where the golden age begins, where it ends, and whether drawing a firm line across so many seasons of a still-running show even makes sense in the first place. Section 6. Defining the Golden Age. Ask 10 different Simpsons fans exactly which seasons count as the Golden Age, and there is a good chance you will get 10 slightly different answers. This is not a small disagreement over minor details. It is a genuine, ongoing debate that critics, fans, and even people who worked on the show have argued about for years without ever settling on one single agreed-upon answer. Some of that disagreement comes down to personal taste, but a surprising amount of it traces back to a specific handful of moments that fans point to again and again as turning points, along with real behind-the-scenes changes in who was actually running the show at any given time. The broadest definition treats almost the entire first decade of the show as its golden age. Under this view, seasons 1 through 10, covering the show's debut in December of 1989, all the way through the end of the 1990s, represent the period when the show was consistently at its sharpest and most inventive. People who favor this wider definition often frame it as the most useful starting point for casual viewers or newcomers, since it captures a full decade of material without forcing anyone to draw too fine a line between one season and the next. A narrower and, according to many longtime fans, more accurate definition shrinks that window considerably, focusing specifically on seasons 3 through 8. Under this view, this 6-season stretch represents the exact period when the show was not simply funny, but was actively redefining what a half-hour television comedy could look and feel like, blending sharp jokes with real emotional stakes in a way that very few shows managed either before or after. Fans who hold this stricter view tend to treat the first 2 seasons as still finding their footing, and treat everything from season 9 onward as a noticeably different, less consistent show. A third common version of the debate splits the difference, pointing to seasons 2 through 8, roughly covering 1990 through 1997, as the true golden stretch. Under this framing, the first season gets treated as a rough draft, since the animation style, character voices, and general tone were all still being worked out during that initial 13-episode run. Fans who support this version tend to agree with the seasons 3 through 8 crowd that something shifted noticeably once season 9 began, but they are willing to extend a bit of extra credit backward into season 2 as the show's true creative rhythm. None of this disagreement is unique to a small, obsessive corner of the internet either. Even people who work directly on the show have weighed in on where the line should be drawn, and their opinions do not always agree with each other. Some cast and crew members have pushed back against the entire idea of a golden age framework in the first place, arguing that the concept unfairly implies that everyone working on later seasons was somehow less talented or less committed to doing good work than the people who came before them. That pushback is a fair point, since plenty of individually strong episodes have aired well outside of every proposed golden age window, no matter which specific range a person chooses to draw. Despite that pushback, most serious fans agree on at least one thing, even if they cannot agree on exactly where the golden era begins. A noticeable shift in the show's tone tone and consistency happened somewhere around its 9th season, and one single episode gets brought up constantly as the clearest, most concrete symbol of that shift. That episode is The Principal and the Pauper, the second episode of the show's 9th season, which first aired on September 28, 1997. Although it aired during season 9, the episode had actually been written and developed during the previous season, under a different showrunner team, making its placement in the schedule something of a coincidence layered on top of everything else that made it controversial. The episode centers on Principal Seymour Skinner, a recurring authority figure who had appeared as a familiar fixture at Springfield Elementary School since the very first episode of the entire series. The plot reveals that the Skinner audiences had known and watched develop over 8 full seasons was in fact an imposter. According to the story, the real Seymour Skinner had died years earlier during his military service in Vietnam, and a soldier named Armin Tamzarian had stolen his identity and returned home pretending to be him, eventually settling into the role of Springfield's school principal under a name that was never really his own. The episode's plot kicks into motion when the real Skinner, played by guest star Martin Sheen, turns out to still be alive after all, and returns to Springfield to reclaim the identity and life that had been taken from him. By the end of the episode, rather than letting this revelation permanently reshape the character going forward, the town of Springfield essentially decides to force everything back to how it was before. The citizens tie the real Skinner to a departing train, sending him away, and they collectively agree to treat Tamzarian's years of impersonation as something the town will simply overlook and allow to continue, restoring the fake Skinner back to his familiar role by the episode's final minutes. This ending meant that, from a storytelling standpoint, almost nothing about the show's ongoing world actually changed. The character everyone had called Principal Skinner for 8 full seasons kept his job, kept his name, and kept behaving exactly as he always had, as if the entire episode had simply never happened. That decision to essentially undo the episode's entire premise by its final scene became one of the biggest sources of criticism directed at it. Many fans and critics reacted with real frustration at the idea that a character who had received years of careful, ongoing development would suddenly be revealed as a total fraud, only for that revelation to be casually erased by the story's own ending rather than meaningfully explored. Series creator Matt Groening himself later said, during commentary recorded for the show's 9th season DVD release, that this episode ranked among his least favorite the show had ever produced. Harry Shearer, the voice actor who had played Skinner from the character's very first appearance, was even more direct in his criticism. Speaking in an interview years later, Shearer recalled telling the writers directly, after first reading the script, that the entire premise felt deeply wrong, arguing that the show was taking something the audience had invested 8 or 9 years of genuine attention and care into, and discarding it for no good reason, especially since the same basic secret identity story idea had already been done before using other characters. Shearer specifically called the choice arbitrary, unnecessary, and disrespectful to the audience that had spent years building a real attachment to the character. Not everyone connected to the episode agreed with that harsh assessment, though. Ken Keeler, the writer credited with the script, has defended his work strongly in the years since it aired, going so far as to call it the best writing he had ever produced up to that point in his career. Bill Oakley and Josh Weinstein, who were serving as the show's showrunners during the season when the episode was originally written, along with incoming showrunner Mike Scully, also spoke up in defense of the episode at various points, pushing back against the idea that it deserved its reputation as one of the show's biggest missteps. Oakley later offered a specific explanation for why the episode landed so poorly with audiences, despite the writing team's confidence in it, observing that the episode had been conceived and structured as a deliberate experiment, but unlike some other clearly experimental episodes the show had produced around the same period, this one simply did not look or feel like an experiment on the surface. Audiences expecting a fairly ordinary episode structure ended up blindsided by a twist that upended 8 years of a familiar character's history, and that mismatch between expectation and delivery created a much sharper sense of frustration than a more clearly telegraphed experimental episode might have produced. The timing of this particular controversy lined up closely with a genuine behind-the-scenes transition happening at almost exactly the same moment. Mike Scully took over as the show's showrunner beginning with season 9, stepping into the role previously held by Bill Oakley and Josh Weinstein. Several familiar writers stayed on through this transition, including John Swartzwelder, George Meyer, and Al Jean, while newer writers joined the staff around the same time as well. Because The Principal and the Pauper aired as the very second episode of Scully's first season in charge, even though it had actually been developed under the previous showrunning team, many casual viewers and critics ended up associating the episode's controversial reception directly with the start of the Scully era. Whether or not that association was entirely fair to how the episode had actually come together behind the scenes. Season 9 carried its own share of real, unrelated sadness as well, adding another layer of change to that particular stretch of the show's history. Phil Hartman, a frequent and beloved guest voice actor who had played two memorable recurring characters, the sleazy but oddly endearing lawyer Lionel Hutz and the washed-up former celebrity Troy McClure, appeared in the season for what would turn out to be the final time. Hartman's last speaking appearance as Hutz came in an episode called Realty Bites. Hartman died on May 28, 1998, and following his death, the show made the decision to permanently retire both of the characters he had voiced, rather than recast either role with a different performer, closing out two long-running pieces of the show's world for good during the same season that had already generated so much debate over its most controversial episode. Given everything happening at once during this particular stretch, a change in creative leadership, the sudden and permanent loss of a favorite guest performer, and an episode that many longtime viewers experienced as a genuine betrayal of years of character development, it makes sense that Season 9 keeps coming up again and again whenever fans try to pinpoint exactly where the Golden Age ends. Whether someone prefers the tighter Seasons 3 through 8 definition, the slightly wider Seasons 2 through 8 version, or the much broader first 10 seasons framing, nearly every version of the debate treats Season 9 as either the final stretch of the Golden Era or the very beginning of a noticeably different show. Very few serious fans place the true end of the Golden Age any later than that particular season, even if they disagree about everything leading up to it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. None of this debate has ever fully settled into one universally accepted answer, and it likely never will, since the argument depends heavily on which specific qualities each individual fan values most in the show, whether that means emotional storytelling, joke density, character consistency, or something else entirely. What almost everyone can agree on, regardless of which exact season range they personally favor, is that a specific handful of episodes produced during this contested stretch of years stand out as some of the strongest, most carefully constructed half-hours the show ever produced. Episodes that critics still point to decades later as proof of exactly what made this particular period of the show so difficult to replicate. Section 7, the episodes critics call untouchable. 3 episodes come up again and again whenever critics and longtime fans try to point at exactly what made this stretch of The Simpsons so hard to match. Marge versus the Monorail, Cape Fear, and You Only Move Twice arrived in 3 different seasons, came from 3 different writers, and told 3 completely different kinds of stories, yet all 3 still get named decades later as proof of the show working at its absolute best. Marge versus the Monorail aired as the 12th episode of the show's 4th season, first appearing on Fox on January 14, 1993. Conan O'Brien wrote the episode, still fairly early in his short run on the writing staff at the time, and Rich Moore directed it. The story kicks off after Mr. Burns gets caught dumping nuclear waste in the town park and is fined $3 million by the Environmental Protection Agency. At a town meeting held to decide how Springfield should spend that unexpected windfall, a fast-talking traveling salesman named Lyle Lanley shows up with an offer nobody in town seems able to resist. Lanley, voiced by recurring guest performer Phil Hartman, convinces the entire town to spend the settlement money on a monorail system, even though nobody in Springfield actually needs one or has any real idea how it works. The episode also features a memorable guest appearance from actor Leonard Nimoy playing himself, and O'Brien wrote the episode's centerpiece musical number, a song called The Monorail Song, working alongside fellow writer Al Jean on the lyrics and melody. The episode has been named one of the strongest half-hours the show has ever produced by a wide range of critics writing years apart from each other. One critic reviewing the show's 4th season as a whole for a major newspaper described that entire season as brilliant from beginning to end, pointing to this episode as one of the clearest examples backing up that claim. Another reviewer, writing about the show's early seasons more broadly, said choosing between the 4th and 5th seasons as the strongest stretch in the show's history felt so difficult that there was no good reason to even even try picking one over the other. A third critic, writing for a Chicago newspaper, pointed directly at Marge versus the monorail alongside 2 other episodes as proof of the show's comic genius during that period. Even people who worked on the episode have spoken about it fondly in the years since. Showrunner Josh Weinstein praised the finished episode publicly, and O'Brien himself has said in later interviews that out of every episode he personally wrote for the show, this one remained his favorite, a distinction that carries some weight given how many other well-regarded scripts came out of his short time on the staff. Cape Fear, the second episode of the show's 5th season, tells a very different kind of story, though it grew out of a similarly chaotic production process. The episode first aired on October 7, 1993, written by John Vitti and directed by Rich Moore. The idea started with writer Wallace Wolodarski, who wanted to build an episode around a parody of the film Cape Fear. The plot follows Bart receiving a string of threatening letters written in blood sent by the recently paroled Sideshow Bob, the show's recurring villain voiced by Kelsey Grammer, who wants revenge against Bart for having testified against him in an earlier episode. To keep Bart safe, the Simpson family goes into hiding, changing their name to the Thompsons and moving on to a rented houseboat, unaware that Bob has already stowed himself away underneath their car to follow them the entire way. What makes the production history of Cape Fear unusual is that the finished episode was originally intended for the previous season rather than season 5. It had actually been produced as the final episode of season 4, right around the time many of the show's original writers and crew members, including people who had worked on the show since its very first season, were leaving to pursue other projects, most notably a new animated series called The Critic. According to Vitti, the general mood in the room during that stretch carried a certain looseness, since much of the original team already had one foot out the door and felt there was little left to lose by taking bigger creative risks. That attitude showed up directly in the finished episode, which leaned harder into pure slapstick and cartoonish gags than a lot of episodes around it, including a sequence where Sideshow Bob gets crushed underneath an entire parade, elephants included, and an extended dream-style sequence involving Homer, a kitchen knife, and a plate of warm brownies meant only to scare Bart briefly before revealing itself as nothing more than a father offering his son a late-night snack. Even with all of that material, the finished episode still ran short of the standard half-hour runtime required to fill its broadcast slot. To stretch the episode out, the production team padded several scenes, including extending the show's opening couch gag and adding a longer sequence involving a short parody of the show's own cartoon within a cartoon, Itchy and Scratchy. None of these fixes solved the timing problem entirely, so the crew turned to a single moment that had originally been written as nothing more than a small, one-time gag. As Sideshow Bob climbs aboard the houseboat the Simpson family is hiding on, he steps on a rake left lying on the deck, and the handle swings up and smacks him directly in the face. To stretch the runtime further, the writers repeated this exact gag again and again, having Bob step onto rake after rake in the same spot, getting hit in the face each time in an almost identical way. The intention behind repeating the joke so many times was to push the sequence past the point of being funny and back around to funny again purely through sheer, absurd repetition. Sources differ slightly on the exact number of rakes involved, with counts placing it anywhere from around 9 to 10 separate hits, but the effect landed exactly as the writers hoped. The rake sequence became one of the most instantly recognizable and frequently referenced moments in the show's entire history, still brought up by fans decades later as a defining example of the show's willingness to let a single joke run far longer than any conventional sense of comic timing would normally allow. The episode's climax leans on Bart's quick thinking rather than any outside rescue. Cornered by Bob on the drifting houseboat and asked if he has any final requests, Bart appeals directly to Bob's vanity, telling him he has a wonderful singing voice and asking him to perform the entire score of the operetta HMS Pinafore before finishing the job. Flattered, Bob agrees and begins singing through the full score, remaining so absorbed in the performance that he fails to notice the houseboat drifting steadily back toward the shore of Springfield. By the time he finishes the final note, Chief Wiggum and a group of armed police officers are already standing on the dock waiting for him, and Bob is arrested once again without ever realizing how thoroughly he had been outmaneuvered. Cape Fear holds a specific piece of behind-the-scenes significance beyond its content as well, since it stands as the final episode written by the original group of writers who had worked on the show continuously since its very first season, most of whom departed for other projects shortly after this episode wrapped production. season. Despite, or perhaps partly because of, its chaotic and improvised production history, the episode has gone on to receive some of the strongest critical recognition of any single episode in the show's history. In 2003, Entertainment Weekly named it the third greatest episode the show had ever produced. The episode also won an Emmy Award for Outstanding Dramatic Score in a Series in 1994, recognizing the show's music work on the episode's many song and score-based gags. Al Jean, who went on to serve as one of the show's longest-running showrunners, has specifically called Cape Fear both his favorite episode built around the Sideshow Bob character and his favorite Simpsons episode overall, out of the hundreds of episodes he has been involved with across his long career on the show. You Only Move Twice, the second episode of the show's 8th season, tells yet another completely different kind of story, built less around slapstick chaos and more around a single, outstanding guest performance. The episode first aired on November 3, 1996, written by John Swartzwelder and directed by Mike B. Anderson. Based on a story idea from writer Greg Daniels, the plot follows Homer accepting a new job offer at a mysterious company called Globex Corporation, prompting the entire family to leave Springfield behind and move into a seemingly perfect planned community called Cypress Creek. Homer's new boss, a relentlessly cheerful and endlessly accommodating man named Hank Scorpio, turns out to be running the company as cover for an elaborate supervillain scheme aimed at seizing control of an entire coastline using an arsenal of advanced weapons and a private army of henchmen, all while treating Homer with more genuine warmth, patience, and generosity than any other boss the character has ever had across the entire series. Hank Scorpio was voiced by Albert Brooks, marking his fourth guest appearance on the show at that point in its run, and critics have consistently pointed to this performance as one of the finest single-episode guest turns the show has ever featured. The entertainment website IGN specifically named You Only Move Twice the best episode of the show's 8th season, and separately named Brooks one of the best guest stars in the show's entire history, citing this exact role as the strongest example of his work on the series. Author Chris Turner, writing about the show's cultural impact in his book Planet Simpson, ranked Brooks as the second best guest performer to ever appear on the show, trailing only the late Phil Hartman, and specifically praised how effortlessly Brooks blended genuine charm with the character's underlying menace throughout the episode. Fan polls conducted years after the episode originally aired have consistently ranked Hank Scorpio near the very top of lists dedicated to the best characters ever to appear in only a single episode, a distinction that reflects just how thoroughly the character managed to stick in viewers' memories despite never returning to the show again in any other storyline. Part of what made the episode so memorable came down to small, carefully placed details rather than any single big joke. The episode's title itself is a direct reference to the James Bond film You Only Live Twice, and the story leans into that connection throughout, including a brief cameo from a character clearly modeled on James Bond himself, appearing as one of Scorpio's many defeated adversaries. Creating the new setting of Cypress Creek required the show's animators to design an entirely new set of backgrounds and layouts distinct from Springfield, giving the episode a visually different feel from most other installments of the show. Alongside the main storyline following Homer and Scorpio, the episode also gave Bart, Lisa, and Marge each their own smaller subplot tied to life in this strange new town, adding extra texture to an episode that could easily have rested entirely on the strength of its central guest performance alone. Looking at these three episodes together, what stands out is how differently each one achieved its reputation as one of the show's finest half-hours. Marge vs. the Monorail built its success around a tightly constructed satire of civic gullibility, carried by a memorable guest appearance and an original song that has stuck in fans' memories for decades. Cape Fear achieved its status almost by accident, born out of a chaotic production stretch, a runtime that refused to fill itself naturally, and a single small joke that grew into one of the most recognizable running gags in the show's history purely through repetition. You Only Move Twice succeeded through pure strength of character writing and guest performance, built almost entirely around how convincingly Albert Brooks brought Hank Scorpio's strange mix of warmth and menace to life across a single guest appearance that never needed a follow-up to become unforgettable. None of these 3 episodes leaned on the same tools to earn their reputation, and that variety says something meaningful about just how many different directions the show's best writing was capable of pulling in during this same general stretch of years. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Individual episodes only tell part of the story of how this era came to be remembered so fondly, though. Behind every one of these specific half hours sat a much larger machine built out of award ceremonies, broadcasting milestones, and official recognitions that, taken together, turned this stretch of television history into something far bigger than any single episode, no matter how carefully written or fondly remembered that episode eventually became. Section 8. Records, Emmys, and a Peabody. Somewhere in the middle of the 1990s, The Simpsons stopped being just a popular cartoon and started collecting the kind of formal recognition usually reserved for prestige dramas and long-respected sitcoms. Awards, world records, and official honors began piling up at a pace that outstripped almost every other show on television at the time, and many of those honors trace directly back to the stretch of seasons fans still argue over calling the Golden Age. The clearest and most concrete milestone came on February 9, 1997, when an episode called The Itchy and Scratchy and Poochie Show aired on Fox. With that broadcast, The Simpsons officially passed The Flintstones to become the longest-running primetime animated television series in American history, a record the Flintstones had held for decades since its own run ended back in the 1960s. Surpassing a show that had defined an entire earlier generation's idea of primetime cartoons carried real symbolic weight, marking a clear line between the era when animated shows aimed almost entirely at children and the newer kind of adult-oriented animated comedy that The Simpsons had helped build from scratch. That was only the beginning of a long list of records the show would go on to collect. In 2009, The Simpsons surpassed a completely different kind of benchmark, breaking past the 435-episode total set decades earlier by The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet, a live-action family sitcom that had run on American television through the 1950s and into the mid-1960s. Passing that number made The Simpsons the longest-running sitcom of any kind in American television history, live-action or animated, a title officially recognized and confirmed by Guinness World Records. Guinness has also confirmed a separate record tied to the sheer scale of the show's guest casting over the years, crediting The Simpsons with featuring the largest number of guest stars ever to appear across a single scripted television series, with the total climbing past 700 individual guest appearances by the time later record checks were conducted. Award recognition started building almost immediately once the half-hour series began airing, well before any of these bigger episode count records became possible, simply because the show had not yet been on the air long enough to challenge them. During its very first season, the show won an Emmy Award and picked up 4 additional nominations, an unusually strong showing for a brand new series on the newest and smallest network in the country. That early momentum never really slowed down. According to figures confirmed by Guinness World Records as of June 26, 2024, The Simpsons has won a total of 37 primetime Emmy Awards out of 100 nominations across its entire run, making it the most decorated animated television series in Emmy history by a wide margin. Breaking that total down by category shows just how many different parts of the show's production have been recognized over the years. 12 of those wins have come specifically in the Outstanding Animated Program category, covering shows an hour or less in length, spread across a long list of years, including the show's earliest seasons in 1990 and 1991, continuing through 1995, 1997, and 1998, 2000 and 2001, and periodically returning again in 2003, 2006, 2008, 2019, and 2023. A much larger chunk of the show's total Emmy wins, 16 in all, has come in the category recognizing outstanding voiceover performance, honoring individual voice actors for specific standout work across different seasons, including a particularly strong showing in 1992, when the show picked up 6 wins in that category alone in a single year. 2 more wins came in a category recognizing outstanding music and lyrics, both arriving in the mid to late 1990s, and 7 additional wins have gone toward recognizing outstanding individual achievement in animation, a category that rewards specific animators and directors for standout technical or artistic work on individual episodes. One detail about the show's Emmy history stands out as a genuine surprise given how beloved certain parts of the show have become among fans. The Treehouse of Horror series, the show's long-running yearly tradition of Halloween-themed anthology episodes built around 3 unconnected short stories, went largely overlooked by Emmy voters for years, despite becoming one of the most anticipated annual events on the show's entire calendar among longtime viewers. The first Treehouse of Horror episode to even receive an Emmy nomination was Treehouse of Horror 6, recognized in 1996, and despite that recognition, the franchise would not actually win an Emmy in the Outstanding Animated Program category until Treehouse of Horror X of So took the prize decades later in 2023, showing just how large a gap can sometimes open up between what fans treasure most and what awards voters choose to formally recognize in any given year. Individual people connected to the show have picked up substantial personal recognition as well, and one name in particular towers over the rest of the credits list when it comes to raw award totals. James L. Brooks, who helped bring Groening's original pitch to life back in the Ullman Shorts era and stayed on as an executive producer throughout the show's run, has won 12 individual Emmy Awards, specifically tied to his work on The Simpsons, a total that stands as the most Emmys any single person has ever won for work connected to one particular show. Brooks's award history stretches back long before The Simpsons ever existed, since he had already built a substantial career producing acclaimed television series like The Mary Tyler Moore Show and Taxi, well before Groening ever sat down in his office lobby. Taken together with the Emmys he earned across those earlier projects and his work on The Tracy Ullman Show, Brooks has assembled one of the largest personal Emmy collections of anyone working anywhere in the television industry, a career total that industry observers have repeatedly pointed to as an outright record for the most primetime Emmy Awards ever won by a single individual across an entire career, spanning multiple decades and multiple completely different shows. Beyond the Emmys, The Simpsons picked up one of the rarer and more prestigious honors available in American broadcasting when it became the first animated series ever to receive a Peabody Award. The Peabody Awards, administered separately from the Emmys, recognize excellence in electronic media more broadly and have traditionally leaned toward honoring news programming, documentaries, and serious dramatic work rather than half-hour comedies, which made this recognition especially notable for a cartoon built around slapstick jokes and a yellow-skinned family. The Peabody Award organization's own official history of the honor describes The Simpsons as likely the most globally recognized television program in the entire history of the medium, a striking claim for an organization that has spent decades evaluating and honoring work across every major category of American broadcasting. The show went on to earn a second Peabody Award decades later in 2020, becoming one of the very few television programs ever recognized by that organization more than once across such a long span of continuous production. Recognition from the broader entertainment industry followed a similar pattern of arriving well outside the normal channels a half-hour cartoon comedy might typically expect. On January 14, 2000, The Simpson family received its own star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, an honor traditionally reserved for individual performers, directors, and occasionally entire ensembles tied to especially significant film or television productions. Placing an animated family alongside decades of real, flesh-and-blood performers along that famous stretch of sidewalk signaled just how thoroughly the show had moved beyond simple cartoon status in the eyes of the entertainment establishment. That same broader cultural embrace showed up again just months earlier in a 1999 issue of Time magazine dedicated to celebrating the greatest achievements in arts and entertainment across the entire 20th century. Time's editors named The Simpsons the best television series of the century in that issue, a sweeping claim that placed the show above every single scripted drama, variety show, and sitcom that had aired across the previous 100 years of American television history. In that same issue, Time went a step further and included Bart Simpson specifically on the Time 100, the magazine's larger list recognizing the century's 100 most influential people across every field imaginable, from politics and science to art and entertainment. Bart stood as the only entirely fictional character to appear anywhere on that list, sharing space with real historical figures who had shaped the actual course of the 20th century through genuine, tangible actions rather than through a television script. That inclusion captured, in a single strange and striking detail, just how far the character had traveled from his origins as a quick sketch drawn on a notepad in a Hollywood office lobby barely more than a decade earlier. Additional recognition followed from other corners of the industry throughout this same general period. Entertainment Weekly's television critic Ken Tucker separately named The Simpsons the greatest television show of the entire 1990s, a decade that had included plenty of other critically acclaimed and commercially successful programs across every major network. Taken all together, this pile of honors, spanning the Emmys, Emmys, the Peabody Award Organization, Guinness World Records, Time Magazine, and the Hollywood Walk of Fame represented an unusually broad and varied kind of recognition for a single television program. Most shows that earn heavy critical praise tend to collect awards concentrated within one or two specific categories, reflecting strength in a particular area, like writing, acting, or production design. The Simpsons, instead, managed to gather serious recognition across nearly every possible category available to a television program, from pure entertainment value and audience size all the way up to formal industry craft awards and even broader cultural significance honors that rarely go to comedies of any kind, animated or otherwise. None of these honors arrived without some tension attached, though, particularly regarding exactly which stretch of the show's history deserved the most credit for building this reputation in the first place. Many of the show's biggest and most prestigious honors, including the original Peabody Award, the Walk of Fame star, and the Time Magazine recognition, arrived either during or very shortly after the years most fans and critics point to as the show's golden age, reinforcing the idea that this particular stretch of seasons represented not just a fan-favorite creative peak, but a period the wider entertainment industry itself was actively recognizing and rewarding in real time as it happened. The show's later, much larger Emmy total and its eventual episode count records took considerably longer to accumulate, continuing to grow steadily across decades of additional seasons long after the period most closely associated with the show's most celebrated creative years had already passed. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Building and maintaining a show capable of earning this scale of recognition required a lot more than clever scripts and memorable jokes, though. Behind every one of these awards and records sat 6 ordinary people showing up to a recording booth to bring these characters to life, and their own relationship with the studio paying for all of this success turned out to be far less smooth and far less celebrated than any of the honors piling up on the show's trophy shelf. Section 9. The voices behind Springfield and the fight over their paychecks. Behind every joke Homer ever delivered, every exasperated sigh from Marge, and every gleeful bit of trouble Bart caused, sat 6 actors doing something most viewers rarely thought about while laughing along at home. Dan Castellaneta voiced Homer Simpson, along with a long list of other recurring characters including Krusty the Clown, Barney Gumble, and Grandpa Simpson. Julie Kavner voiced Marge, along with her 2 sharp-tongued sisters, Patty and Selma. Nancy Cartwright voiced Bart, along with schoolyard characters like Nelson Muntz and Ralph Wiggum. Yeardley Smith voiced Lisa. Hank Azaria voiced a whole roster of Springfield regulars, including Apu Nahasapima Petalon, Mo Sheslack, and Chief Wiggum. Harry Shearer rounded out the group, voicing Ned Flanders, Mr. Burns, Waylon Smithers, Principal Skinner, news anchor Kent Brockman, and several others besides. Between them, these 6 performers gave voice to the vast majority of Springfield's population, often playing multiple characters within the very same scene. When the show first began airing as a half-hour series in 1989, none of these 6 performers were particularly well-known names. They signed on for a modest $30,000 per episode, a reasonable rate for a new, unproven cartoon on the smallest and newest network in the country, but hardly a figure that reflected star-level pay. What made this number remarkable in hindsight was how long it stayed exactly the same. That $30,000 rate remained locked in place for nearly the entire decade that followed, staying flat all the way through 1998, a stretch of time that happened to line up almost perfectly with the years most fans and critics point to as the show's creative peak. In other words, for essentially the entire run most people consider the Golden Age, the 6 performers responsible for bringing that acclaimed writing to life were still being paid at a rate set back when the show was an unproven gamble rather than a cultural institution. By 1998, the mismatch between what the cast earned and what the show had become was hard to ignore. The Simpsons was, by that point, an enormous rating success, a repeat award winner, and a merchandising machine generating hundreds of millions of dollars a year. 4 of the 6 principal actors, Hank Azaria, Dan Castellaneta, Harry Shearer, and Yeardley Smith, entered into serious contract negotiations with Fox that year, pushing for a substantial increase in pay. Julie Kavner and Nancy Cartwright were not part of this particular standoff, since both of them had already worked out separate, earlier agreements of their own with the studio. The 4 holdout actors were not simply asking for a bigger flat salary either. According to reporting from that period, they specifically wanted a share of the the licensing, merchandising, and future television syndication revenue tied to the show, a request that reflected just how much money the Simpsons brand had generated through channels completely separate from its regular broadcast episodes. Fox's initial response to these demands was blunt. Rather than moving quickly toward a compromise, the studio pushed back hard, going so far as to hire casting directors in 5 different cities across the country to actively search for replacement voice actors who could step into these roles if the current cast refused to accept the studio's terms. This was not an idle threat, meant only to apply pressure during negotiations. Casting professionals were genuinely brought on and tasked with finding potential substitutes, a serious and public escalation that put real pressure on the 4 actors at the center of the dispute. The standoff grew tense enough that the cast reportedly considered a strike at one point during the process, and production on new episodes was put on hold while the 2 sides remained at an impasse. Series creator Matt Groening did not stay quiet on the sidelines during this standoff. He spoke out publicly in support of the actors, backing their position during a dispute that put him in an unusual spot, standing alongside performers whose voices had become inseparable from characters he had personally created, while the studio distributing his show pushed back against those very performers. Groening's support added a notable voice to the actors' side of the negotiating table, coming from someone whose name carried real weight given his position as the person most closely identified with the show's original creative vision. Eventually, after several weeks of negotiation, both sides reached an agreement rather than following through on Fox's threat to recast the roles entirely. The 4 holdout actors saw their pay rise substantially, settling at $125,000 per episode, more than 4 times their original rate, and a figure that finally reflected something closer to the show's actual scale and success by that point. Once terms were finalized, production resumed almost immediately. According to contemporary reporting on the settlement, the full cast gathered for a script reading on April 2, 1998, followed shortly after by a recording session on April 6 for that year's Halloween-themed episode, allowing the show to get back on track without any real disruption to its broadcast schedule once the dispute had been resolved. This 1998 standoff turned out to be only the first in a recurring pattern that would repeat itself several more times across the years that followed, though each later round of negotiation grew somewhat less contentious than the one before it. In April of 2001, the 6 principal actors negotiated a new deal that moved considerably more smoothly than the tense standoff 3 years earlier. That agreement set their pay at $100,000 per episode for the show's 13th and 14th seasons, rising further to $125,000 per episode by the 15th season, along with a $1 million bonus for each actor in place of any future syndication payments. As part of that same round of negotiations, Dan Castellaneta and his wife, writer and producer Deb LaCusta, also secured a separate development deal with Fox. Further rounds of contract renegotiation followed in 2004 and again in 2008, each one pushing the cast's pay significantly higher than before. In 2004, the cast intentionally skipped several scheduled table readings as a form of pressure during negotiations, initially seeking as much as $360,000 per episode before eventually settling for a raise to $250,000 per episode once the dispute resolved about a month later. The 2008 round of negotiations pushed things even further, with the cast again asking for a steep increase, this time reportedly as high as $500,000 per episode, before ultimately settling on a deal that paid as much as $440,000 per episode. When, as part of that particular agreement, Castellaneta also formally became a writer and consulting producer on the show, expanding his role well beyond simply voicing Homer. Later still, in 2011, the financial picture flipped in the opposite direction for the first time. Rather than the cast pushing for another raise, Fox announced it would only renew the show, extending its run into a record-breaking 25th season if the actors agreed to accept reduced compensation instead, facing the possibility of the show ending entirely rather than continuing under smaller paychecks. The cast agreed to a pay cut, dropping their per-episode rate from $440,000 down to an estimated $300,000 per episode, a substantial reduction, though still an extraordinary sum compared to where their pay had started back in 1989. Looking back at this entire long-running pattern of negotiation and occasional confrontation, what stands out most clearly is just how completely disconnected the cast's actual pay was from the show's creative creative and cultural peak. The years most fans point to when discussing the show's very best writing and most memorable episodes, roughly the stretch running from the early to the late 1990s, lined up almost exactly with the years these 6 performers were earning the least, relative to what the show was actually generating in ratings, awards, and merchandise revenue. Only once that celebrated creative stretch had already run its course, and the debate over exactly where the golden age ended was already well underway among fans and critics, did the people voicing these characters finally start seeing pay that came anywhere close to matching the show's real scale and success. That mismatch between creative peak and fair compensation reflects something a little bit sad sitting quietly underneath one of television's great success stories, a reminder that the actors bringing these now iconic voices to life spent the show's most celebrated years working for a fraction of what later became standard, simply because nobody, including the performers themselves, fully grasped just how enormous and enduring this particular cartoon family was about to become. Behind-the-scenes changes were not limited to contracts and paychecks either, though. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Around this same general period, the show's creative leadership itself was shifting in ways that would eventually give fans and critics one more clear marker to point toward whenever the conversation turned to exactly when and why this golden stretch of episodes finally came to a close. Section 10. The Golden Age Ends. Sam Simon, the writer and producer who had helped shape the show's earliest scripts, alongside Groening and Brooks, was already gone from The Simpsons well before most fans marked the end of its golden age. Simon left the show and its production company, Gracie Films, in 1993. Right in the middle of the stretch, many critics consider the show's absolute creative peak. He gave a simple explanation for the decision years later, saying plainly that he had stopped enjoying the work, and adding that nearly every show he had ever worked on eventually turned him into someone he did not like being. Before he left, Simon negotiated a deal that kept his name in the credits as executive producer and secured him a share of the show's profits going forward, an arrangement that continued paying him tens of millions of dollars a year for decades afterward, even though he had stopped actively working on new episodes. Groening later described Simon as one of the smartest and funniest writers he had ever worked alongside, while also acknowledging that Simon could be difficult and, in Groening's own words, mentally unbalanced at times. Simon's early departure meant that one of the 3 people most responsible for building the show's original foundation was already watching from a distance by the time the seasons most fans now celebrate were still being written. The show's day-to-day leadership kept changing hands throughout the 1990s, with different pairs and individuals stepping into the showrunner role as the decade went on. Al Jean and Mike Reiss ran the show for several seasons after joining as its very first staff writers. David Merkin took over the role for a stretch after them. Bill Oakley and Josh Weinstein followed, guiding the show through its 8th season and into the start of its 9th before handing control over to Mike Scully, whose tenure as showrunner is the one most closely associated with the years fans typically point to when discussing the end of the Golden Age. One episode produced during the Oakley and Weinstein era stands out as a particularly clear signal that the show's writers were themselves becoming aware of just how far its internal logic had stretched by that point. Homer's Enemy, the 23rd episode of the show's 8th season, first aired on May 4th, 1997. It was written by John Swartzwelder, based on an idea pitched by executive producer Bill Oakley and directed by Jim Reardon. The episode introduces a new character named Frank Grimes, hired as a fellow employee at the Springfield nuclear power plant, who reacts to Homer with something none of Springfield's other residents ever quite managed across the entire series up to that point: genuine, grounded outrage. Grimes, whose design and backstory were partly shaped by the character William Foster from the 1993 film Falling Down, has spent his entire life working hard for very little reward, and he cannot understand or accept how a man as lazy and incompetent as Homer keeps stumbling into comfort and success without ever seeming to deserve any of it. Grimes spends the episode trying repeatedly to expose Homer as a fraud in front of their co-workers, only to watch each attempt backfire completely. At one point, he tricks Homer into entering a nuclear power plant design contest, fully expecting the the entry to embarrass him publicly, only for Homer to win the contest anyway, since it turns out to have been intended for children rather than adults. Rather than turning against Homer the way Grimes expects, Homer's co-workers simply cheer him on, treating the entire situation as one more harmless quirk rather than any kind of scandal. Pushed past his breaking point by watching Homer succeed yet again without consequence, Grimes suffers a complete breakdown, begins imitating Homer's mannerisms and habits in an increasingly unhinged way, and eventually grabs a set of high-voltage wires without wearing any safety gear, electrocuting himself and dying almost instantly. The episode closes with an unusually dark final image, even by the show's own standards, showing Homer falling asleep during Grimes' own funeral, muttering a request to change the channel, while the other mourners simply laugh off the moment as one more familiar bit of Homer being Homer. Matt Groening later singled this episode out directly when asked about his personal favorites among the hundreds the show has produced, explaining that the idea behind it came from asking what a genuinely realistic person would think and feel if they actually had to work alongside someone like Homer in real life, rather than existing safely inside a cartoon built to forgive him for everything. Critics writing about the episode in later years have pointed to it as one of the clearest examples of the show turning its own internal logic into the subject of the joke itself, using Grimes as a stand-in for the audience's own unspoken awareness that Homer's constant, consequence-free success only works because everyone else in Springfield exists within the same forgiving cartoon rules that Homer does. Once a character bound by ordinary human logic entered that same world and reacted the way any real person actually would, the show revealed just how much of its comfort depended on nobody around Homer ever taking his behavior as seriously as an outsider naturally would. That kind of sharp, self-aware writing sat right alongside the growing sense among fans that the show's tone was beginning to shift in a different direction. As leadership passed from Oakley and Weinstein into Mike Scully's hands, starting with the 9th season, many longtime viewers felt the show leaned more heavily into broader, more cartoonish plots and jokes built around exaggerated situations, compared to the tighter blend of grounded emotional storytelling and sharp satire that had defined earlier seasons. This shift did not happen instantly or completely, and plenty of individual episodes produced under Scully's leadership still earned real praise from fans and critics alike. Still, the change in creative direction became one more piece of evidence fans point to when discussing why this particular stretch of seasons feels different from what came before it, adding a real, tangible shift in tone and storytelling philosophy to sit alongside the more symbolic turning point represented by the principal and the pauper. Looking back across everything covered in this retrospective, the show's golden age emerges as a period defined less by any single clean beginning or ending, and more by an unusual convergence of talent, timing, and circumstance that proved almost impossible to sustain indefinitely. A cartoonist's last-minute decision in a lobby produced a family that somehow ended up on t-shirts, chart-topping records, government speeches, and Emmy stages within just a few years. A room full of writers pulled largely from one specific college humor magazine built a comedic voice distinct enough that fans still argue over which exact seasons deserve the Golden Age label. And 6 performers who had no idea what they were signing up for in 1989 spent the show's most celebrated years earning a fraction of what the show around them was worth, long before anyone, themselves included, understood just how far this particular family from Springfield was going to travel. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.